A small flickering light from the ceiling cast a dull glow across the cramped living room as the old footage played on an outdated television set. A mother's trembling hands gripped the remote, pausing and rewinding, every click dragging her heart deeper into a place she never thought she'd visit. The audio buzzed with static, the camera angle shifting to a corner of a gaudily decorated hotel suite. Then the room on the screen jolted with movement. White lace from a hastily discarded train, an arm entwined with a lean, male figure who was definitely not her son. A single word tumbled from her mouth, a bitter condemnation that hung in the stale air. She couldn't believe she was watching her son's new wife in the arms of another man, but there it was, unstoppable, undeniable, captured for eternity on the wedding videographer's personal footage. Even in that grainy resolution, the betrayal blazed bright. She pressed pause and stared, heartbreak and outrage mingling in her eyes until they burned. She felt certain the footage was real, no deepfake or digital manipulation. It was as raw as any heartbreak she had experienced in her entire life. Still trembling, she turned off the TV, letting the darkness consume her. In that silence, only one thought cut through the heaviness. She had to figure out how to tell her son, or maybe whether to tell him at all. Then she realized there was something else at stake, something bigger than her immediate anger or sorrow. If this was on the tape, who else might have seen it? And was this nothing more than a private indiscretion, or was there something more sinister behind the camera lens and the role of the photographer himself? The events leading to that dreadful discovery had begun long before the wedding ceremony, but no one noticed the subtle signs that might have warned them of the chaos about to ensue. Caden, the groom, was the kind of man who believed that hard work eventually paid off. After spending his 20s juggling student loans, shifts at a repair shop, and nights studying for a degree he never quite finished, he finally hit a lucky break. He landed a decent job managing logistics for a small import-deport company, which soon introduced him to a wide circle of associates, clients, and potential friends. His cautious upbringing never let him trust people easily, and he took time to warm up in social situations, but he had a disarming sincerity that drew good people close, and by age 32, he felt he was on the path to building something that resembled the future he'd always wanted. He met Jade at a corporate networking event. She was there on behalf of a new marketing startup trying to partner with his company. Her eyes sparkled with an intensity that matched her quick wit, and Caden found himself gravitating toward her sharp mind. Over drinks, she talked about wanting to start her own consulting firm. She'd grown up with a single mother in a rougher part of the city. She had always been taught to fight for everything she wanted, never to rely on anyone for a handout. Jade's ambition and energy were different from the calm, steady presence Caden typically sought, but her fire was irresistible. He found himself offering to drive her home that evening, and the conversation didn't stop even when they arrived at her apartment building. Within months, they were an item, living together in a modest high-rise apartment downtown, balancing their busy schedules. His mother, Lorraine, who had always worried that Caden might get used by someone who saw only his potential and not his vulnerabilities, was initially guarded toward Jade. But Jade worked diligently to win Lorraine's approval. She'd invite Lorraine for Sunday brunches, compliment her recipe for apple tarts, and ask her about the family's backstory. Reluctantly, Lorraine let her guard down. Caden's father was long gone, having left when Caden was just a boy, so Lorraine liked having a strong female presence around her son. Over time, Jade and Lorraine found a fragile but steady rhythm of respect, if not full-fledged warmth. Jade, for her part, seemed happy to be accepted, and the tension that had initially lurked beneath the surface settled into an uneasy alliance that both women maintained for Caden's sake. The proposal came a year later at a city charity gala. Caden nervously dropped to one knee amidst a swirl of black-tie guests. Jade, though never one for public displays, found herself overwhelmed. She said yes, tears in her eyes, as cameras flashed and an audience cheered. The ring was elegant, not overly large, but it shimmered perfectly under the ballroom's chandeliers. The moment was captured by a local news outlet covering the gala, and soon a short clip of their engagement circulated on social media, garnering thousands of views and congratulatory comments. For a couple who had just begun to taste the sweet rush of professional success, it felt like life had aligned in their favor. Wedding planning was swift and intense. Jade and Caden were both busy, so Jade hired a planner, a friend of a friend named Miriam, who specialized in high-end city weddings. Miriam was known for flamboyant touches, like custom neon signs or dramatic floral arches, which Jade found simultaneously tacky and irresistible. For all her independence, Jade did harbor a secret dream of a lavish, over-the-top celebration, the kind of wedding she had never thought she could afford growing up. Miriam made it happen. The deposit for the downtown Grand Hotel, the top-tier caterers, the big band hired to perform for 5 hours straight. It was all far beyond any budget Caden had anticipated, but Jade worked her persuasive magic. She promised him that, after all this stress, they'd settle down into a normal routine without the burden of massive debt. Caden believed her. He opened his wallet as wide as his heart, though a quiet anxiety gnawed at him. Money wasn't the only complication. Lorraine insisted they hold the ceremony in the family's old church, the same church where Lorraine had married Caden's father decades ago. But Jade wanted the wedding in a sleek urban hotel. Lorraine saw it as a betrayal of tradition, but Jade stood firm, claiming the church's aesthetic was too old-fashioned. Already friction crackled between bride and mother-in-law, yet somehow they reached a compromise. They'd perform a small blessing ceremony at the church a week before, then do the main affair at the hotel. Lorraine grudgingly accepted, though she made a pointed remark about how real families honor old ways. The tension simmered, neither side truly letting go of their grudges. Still, they all marched forward, one deposit after another, one decision after the next, forging a path to what should have been a joyous day. News of the wedding spread among Caden's colleagues and Jade's wide professional network. It was to be a city event with high-profile guests, local entrepreneurs, even a prominent social media influencer or two. So when Jade scrolled through an online wedding directory and found a photographer named Darius, she was immediately intrigued by his tagline, "Capturing moments so real, you'll feel them in your bones." A few of Jade's friends recognized him too. Apparently, he had done some avant-garde photo series for celebrity couples. Jade was sold. She booked him on the spot, paying his steep rate without blinking. Caden, more oblivious to the wedding industry's ins and outs, simply nodded, trusting Jade's choice. Darius had an easy confidence about him, which Caden initially interpreted as a hallmark of artistic passion. It was during one of the wedding rehearsals that things took the first subtle turn. Darius had joined them to scout the venue, observe the lighting, plan his angles. He was charming in a sly, insinuating way. He complimented Jade frequently, a little too frequently, noticing how the light caught her profile, how her posture exuded elegance when she leaned against the marble banister. Jade soaked up the attention, laughing it off whenever Caden teased her about having a personal paparazzo. Lorraine, watching from the sidelines, felt something about Darius was off, but she couldn't pinpoint it. She told herself she was just being protective, paranoid even, so she swallowed her doubts and decided to keep a closer eye on him. The big day arrived in a flurry of panic and excitement. Jade's morning began at a top-tier salon, accompanied by her bridesmaids, sipping champagne between hairstyling sessions. Meanwhile, Caden paced in a separate suite with his groomsmen, checking to make sure all the vendor payments had gone through and that each guest had the correct directions. Darius, camera in hand, floated between the bride and groom's camps, capturing candids. He seemed to be everywhere at once. On the roof, capturing a wide shot of the city skyline, in the hallway, catching Jade adjusting her veil, in the men's suite, grabbing a shot of Caden in a moment of quiet reflection. Nothing appeared unusual, except perhaps for the lingering looks Darius gave Jade whenever she glanced his way. The ceremony in the grand ballroom started at dusk. Strings of fairy lights glittered across the high ceiling. Jade's dress shimmered in the warm glow of chandeliers. She walked down the aisle, escorted by her tearful mother, while Caden stood at the altar, nerves and love dancing across his face. Vows were exchanged, rings slid onto trembling fingers, and an eruption of applause sealed their marriage in front of 200 guests. Lorraine watched, dabbing at her eyes, a small part of her still uneasy, though she couldn't name exactly why. During the toasts at the reception, Jade's best friend from childhood recounted rebellious teenage stories, drawing laughter and occasional gasps. Caden's best man cracked jokes about Caden's meticulous planning and how Jade was a fierce go-getter who had turned Caden's life upside down. Wine flowed, the band played, guests spilled onto the dance floor. The night seemed perfect, each moment carefully curated for maximum joy. As the formalities gave way to late-night revelry, Jade snuck off to a quieter hotel lounge to catch her breath. That's when Darius found her. He was in search of artistic, candid solitude, or so he claimed. They talked for longer than they should have, swirling champagne in tall glasses, voices hushed and charged with an undercurrent of something unspoken. A conversation that should have remained professional began to shift. Jade, tipsy from the day's emotions and the constant swirl of champagne, found herself confiding in this near stranger. She vented about the financial pressures, Lorraine's judgments, and her own gnawing fears that she might not be the perfect wife Caden deserved. Darius listened intently, offering solace in the form of empathetic eyes and softly murmured reassurances. He had a magnetism that gently insisted on closeness. In her intoxicated state, Jade didn't pull away when he brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Back at the reception, Caden was ushered into group photos, forced to sample the elaborate dessert table, and politely told to greet relatives he hadn't seen in years. He was oblivious to the emotional storm brewing in that secluded lounge. Lorraine, however, noticed Jade's absence. She left her seat to find the bride, muttering about how Jade was missing the cake-cutting fiasco and the father-daughter dance. She never would have guessed that mere moments earlier, Jade's breath had caught in her throat as Darius leaned in, his lips a hair's breadth from hers. Hearing footsteps down the hallway, they sprang apart. Jade's cheeks were flushed, but she forced a wide smile, pretending she was simply collecting herself before rejoining the party. Lorraine approached, suspicion flaring in her eyes, but Jade made a quick excuse. The heels were killing her, she needed a breather. With no evidence of wrongdoing, Lorraine had no choice but to accept it. They returned to the festivities. The evening wore on, and most guests were too busy enjoying their own night to notice subtle glances exchanged between bride and photographer. When the crowd finally dwindled and the newlyweds headed to their honeymoon suite upstairs, Darius packed his gear, carefully transferring memory cards from cameras to his laptop, reviewing clips in a corner of the lobby. The staff was folding chairs and removing centerpieces, the band was packing up instruments, and a wave of exhaustion hit the hotel as it braced for the quiet that would come once everyone left. No one was paying much attention to Darius as he studied the day's footage. An odd smirk crossed his lips a couple of times, as though he'd captured moments more intimate than any paid photographer had a right to. At around 2 a.m, Jade, tipsy and brimming with adrenaline, left the honeymoon suite. She told Caden she was going to fetch some water and maybe a snack from the hotel's 24-hour cafe. Stumbling in the hallway, she ran into Darius again. Whether it was the cumulative stress, the emotional overload, or the champagne's blurring effect, she didn't know. But something about Darius's self-assured presence felt like an escape from her swirling doubts. She followed him into a deserted corridor near the administrative offices. One thing led to another, and logic vanished in the haze of passion and vulnerability. Their whispers, their rushed breathing, the rustle of her gown, all were caught on a small camera rig Darius had, set aside but apparently still rolling. He either forgot to switch it off, or maybe he didn't want to. Whatever the truth, that camera recorded every damning moment of betrayal. By dawn, Jade returned to the suite, disheveled but determined to act as if nothing had happened. She slipped into bed beside Caden, who was deeply asleep, oblivious to the biggest heartbreak lurking right under his nose. In the days that followed, the newlyweds flew to an exotic island for their honeymoon. They posted pictures of pristine beaches and romantic dinners, racking up likes and envious comments. Lorraine was relieved that everything seemed fine, though she kept having nightmares about the wedding day, an inexplicable sense of dread she couldn't shake. Caden, oblivious, was basking in post-wedding bliss, excited to begin the next chapter of his life. Meanwhile, Darius finalized the official wedding photos and highlight videos. He delivered them to Jade and Caden with professional courtesy, even throwing in a few extra shots for social media. None of those standard materials contained the footage from that night. That particular clip remained in his possession, presumably stashed away for reasons only he knew. The real trouble erupted once Jade and Caden were back home, sorting through their mail and wedding gifts, re-establishing routine. Lorraine, who had done some housekeeping in their apartment while they were gone, discovered an unlabeled USB drive in a small padded envelope delivered to their mailbox. The note attached read, "Wedding photos, master copy." She assumed it was another batch from the photographer, perhaps additional raw footage or high-res images. Curious, she popped it into the laptop. That's when she found the folder labeled private. Inside was the catastrophic video file. She opened it, expecting maybe outtakes or behind-the-scenes bloopers. Instead, she witnessed the horrifying truth. Mortified, she tried to close it but found herself trapped in that moment of voyeuristic disbelief. She watched enough to confirm the identities, then slammed the laptop shut. Her heart pounded, and for a few moments she simply sat there, wrestling with shock and fury. In a swirl of confused adrenaline, Lorraine paced the living room. Her mind whirled. Should she confront Jade? Tell Caden? Alert the entire family? Call the police on Darius for blackmail attempts? She had no idea if it even counted as blackmail, but it felt like extortion might be on the horizon if Darius intended to use this footage. Why else would a piece of it show up unannounced in their mailbox? But maybe she was overreacting. Perhaps it was some twisted accident, a file mistakenly included. Yet that explanation seemed far-fetched. She decided to confront Jade first, woman to woman. She wanted to see Jade's face when shown the evidence. She wanted to hear Jade try to explain away this absolute betrayal. But that rage mingled with heartbreak because Lorraine had begun to care for Jade in her own reserved way. And now she was forced to see Jade not just as flawed, but truly unfaithful, right from the start of her marriage. Lorraine invited Jade for coffee under the pretense of discussing wedding thank you cards. They met at a quiet cafe near the apartment. Jade seemed normal, if a bit frazzled from re-entering her hectic work life after the honeymoon. After some small talk about how the trip was, Lorraine cut to the chase, pulling the USB drive from her purse and placing it on the table. Jade's eyes flickered with confusion, then a trace of fear. Before Jade could fabricate a denial, Lorraine told her exactly what she had seen. Jade's face went deathly pale, her eyes darting around as though searching for an escape route. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked and died in her throat. Lorraine leaned forward, fury lining every syllable, demanding explanations. Jade finally found her voice, quietly begging Lorraine not to tell Caden. She insisted it was a moment of drunken madness, a mistake she deeply regretted. She claimed she had no idea Darius had recorded them. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she swore it meant nothing, that she was mortified, that she loved Caden truly. Lorraine, unconvinced, spat out that Jade's brand of love had a twisted definition if this was how she started her marriage. Jade sobbed, attracting glances from other patrons, but Lorraine couldn't bring herself to feel pity. She was too outraged to extend compassion. Lorraine left the cafe, leaving the USB behind with Jade, instructing her to do whatever she wanted with that vile piece of evidence. But Jade knew the problem wasn't so easily solved. If Lorraine had received the file, who else might have a copy? And more importantly, why had Darius sent it? Jade reached out to him, hoping to figure out his intentions. Darius picked up on the second ring, speaking in a tone so casual it nearly drove Jade over the edge. She demanded to know why he sent the footage, but he claimed ignorance. He said maybe his assistant had mailed all the raw files by mistake. Jade, seething, told him if he tried anything else, she would take legal action. Darius laughed softly, pointing out that any legal case would drag Jade through a scandal far worse than anything he might face. He ended the call with a vague statement about wanting to meet in person to clear the air. Jade was trapped. She wanted to protect her marriage, but she also realized that one false move could set off a chain reaction of blackmail or public humiliation. Meanwhile, Lorraine faced a moral crossroads. Should she keep this secret for the sake of her son's happiness, or was the truth too damaging to remain hidden? She felt physically sick remembering the footage, Jade's distressed pleas, the gut-wrenching betrayal of seeing her son's new wife with another man. Her motherly instinct told her to protect Caden, but from what? From heartbreak? Or from living a lie? She decided to consult an old friend, a retired detective named Gregory, with whom she had occasionally exchanged pleasantries over the years. She showed up at his small suburban home, trembling with nerves. Gregory listened quietly, eyebrows knitting in concern. He explained that, from a legal standpoint, there might be issues regarding unauthorized recording or distribution of explicit material, but he also cautioned Lorraine against launching into a full-blown legal crusade without understanding the personal consequences. He advised her to tread carefully, to gather information before she made a move that could blow up the family's life. Lorraine appreciated his counsel, but she also felt a deep unrest. She just wanted justice for her son, in whatever form that meant. As days turned into a couple of weeks, Jade sank into a spiral of guilt. Caden noticed something was off. She was jumpy, making excuses to stay late at work, but he chalked it up to post-wedding exhaustion. She often found herself perched at the edge of their bed at night, staring at the ring on her finger, remembering the look on Lorraine's face in that cafe. She knew it was only a matter of time before Lorraine decided to tell Caden the truth, but Jade hoped she could somehow fix the situation first. One morning, Jade mustered the courage to meet Darius in a public place, a coffee shop downtown, dreading the conversation. She was prepared to beg, threaten, or negotiate anything to keep that footage from finding its way to more people. Darius arrived fashionably late, wearing a confident smirk. He insisted the footage was a fluke, something he had no intention of releasing, but Jade sensed he was testing her reaction, gauging how desperate she was. He flirted with the idea of them maintaining contact, maybe even continuing whatever they had started that night. Jade felt revulsion twist her stomach. She glared, telling him she wanted nothing more to do with him. He laughed again, stood up, and simply walked away, leaving her with a half-finished latte and a swirl of dread. That same afternoon, Jade returned home to find Lorraine sitting in the living room with Caden. The tension in the air was palpable. Lorraine's eyes were cold steel, and Caden looked confused, perhaps slightly alarmed. He had just gotten off work and was still in his office clothes. Jade's pulse hammered. Lorraine looked at her son, looked at Jade, and then quietly said, "I can't do this anymore." Those words felt like a blade. She handed Caden a small envelope containing a note, telling him to open it after she left. Before Jade could protest, Lorraine brushed past, leaving them both in stunned silence. Caden turned his gaze to Jade, desperate for an explanation, but Jade had none to give. They stared at each other, the hush in the room thick with anxiety. Caden opened the envelope and found a short letter in Lorraine's meticulous handwriting. "My beloved son, I discovered something about Jade that shatters me to my core. I have evidence she was unfaithful on your wedding night. I can't watch you live a lie. I can't hold this in anymore. If you need to see it, I have it. Your mother." Caden froze, the blood draining from his face. Jade burst into tears, crumpling to the floor, desperately trying to hold on to him. She spilled out the entire story, confessing her stupidity, her weakness, insisting it was a drunken mistake she wished she could undo. Caden was silent, rigid as a statue. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, asking why. She had no coherent answer except regret. His eyes shone with betrayal, and he walked out, leaving Jade sobbing on the living room carpet. For the next few days, he crashed at a friend's place, ignoring Jade's calls. Word got out slowly but surely. Lorraine confided in an old cousin, who in turn told another relative, and soon the rumor mill was in full swing among the extended family. Jade found hateful messages from a few acquaintances who claimed they'd heard she was unfaithful on her wedding day. She realized the story was morphing into a sensational rumor. The humiliating irony was that what she had done was already indefensible, and now it was swirling into an exaggerated legend. At her office, Jade struggled to focus, half expecting someone to approach her with tabloids. She worried that Darius might leak the footage online. Each day, she checked social media anxiously, expecting the worst. Caden, meanwhile, reached out to a lawyer friend for advice on annulments or divorces. He wasn't sure if he was ready to end the marriage, but he couldn't picture living with the knowledge that his wife had betrayed him in the very hotel where they'd celebrated their union. It was a cosmic joke, a twisted tragedy. He drank more than usual, stared at old photos of Jade, remembering all the moments he believed were real. His mother tried to comfort him, but he resented her too, for revealing the secret in such a public, humiliating manner. His sense of betrayal extended to everyone. He felt alone, humiliated, and furious. The heartbreak weighed on him, morphing into something darker. Eventually, Caden confronted Jade, meeting at a diner they used to frequent. She looked tired, her eyes puffy, her once fierce demeanor diminished. Between shaking hands and quiet sobs, she repeated her apology, explaining she had no explanation except that she'd been overwhelmed. She felt overshadowed by the wedding, the expectations, the money, the spotlight, and made a horrific mistake. She acknowledged that she deserved every bit of anger he felt. She begged for another chance, even if she had to grovel every day. In that moment, Caden's rage flared, but beneath it lay confusion and a flicker of the love he once felt. He told her he needed time, that he didn't know if he could ever forgive or trust her again. Jade nodded, tears slipping down her face, accepting that she had shattered the most sacred bond. That night they parted ways in sorrow. In the midst of the personal agony, Darius seemed to be waiting in the shadows. He hadn't made any overt blackmail attempt yet, but Jade couldn't ignore the possibility. The next day she tried calling him again, desperate to retrieve any copies of that footage. He didn't answer. She left messages that went unreplied. Growing frantic, she considered hiring her own lawyer or a private investigator, anything to ensure Darius wouldn't release the tape. Yet something told her there was more to his silence than a mere waiting game. It felt like he was orchestrating a bigger plan. Fear gnawed at her and she hardly slept. A few weeks later, the next blow hit. An anonymous tip was sent to a local gossip blog known for sensationalizing personal scandals. The blog posted a vague blind item. A newlywed in the city's professional scene was caught on tape in a shocking betrayal with a staff member at her own wedding. The internet lit up with speculation. Those who knew Jade and Caden quickly pieced it together, fueling an online rumor storm. Jade's phone blew up with calls and messages. Her coworkers whispered behind her back, and Caden found himself the subject of pitying looks from his colleagues. The invasion of privacy left them both feeling violated. This was no longer just a betrayal within the family, it was public humiliation on a grand scale. Lorraine's guilt surged. She hadn't intended to ruin her son's life, only to protect him from living a lie. Now it felt like the entire city was mocking him. She spent nights lying awake, tormented by the image of that footage and the role she played in unleashing the truth. Meanwhile, Caden, humiliated but also suspecting that the leak might have come from Darius, considered pressing charges. Yet to do so would mean confirming to the world that the tape existed and that Jade was indeed the woman in it. The scandal was a cat-and-mouse game, with Darius apparently pulling strings from behind the scenes. Then came the final nudge that elevated this from a moral scandal to a legal matter. Jade received an envelope with no return address containing screenshots of an email chain that suggested someone had tried to broker a deal for the footage. It looked like Darius was negotiating a price with a tabloid to sell the uncut tape. The sums were large and the tone was exploitative. Jade's heart pounded with terror. If that tape went public, the humiliation would be infinite. Caden, when informed, erupted in fury, marching to the police station with Jade to file a complaint, or at least to start a paper trail indicating potential extortion. The detective on duty listened, but he seemed skeptical. These cases were complicated, and it wasn't even clear if a crime had been committed beyond infidelity. They left the station with no clear resolution, just a sense of foreboding. A swirl of rumors, partial truths, and legal uncertainties followed. A journalist from a local TV station approached Jade, claiming to want her side of the story. She refused. Another tried to corner Caden for an exclusive interview. He responded with an expletive. Lorraine, deeply distressed, stayed mostly in her home, shutting out phone calls and texts. Gossip columns speculated about the marriage's imminent breakdown, salivating at the prospect of a messy divorce. Jade's workplace quietly suggested she take a leave of absence until the scandal died down, effectively suspending her. She retreated to the apartment, alone, overshadowed by boxes of wedding memories that felt like a cruel joke. Her guilt was immense, and her fear was crippling. She tried calling Caden repeatedly, but he rarely picked up. On the occasions when he did, he mostly sighed and asked her to leave him alone for now. She complied, tears stinging her eyes every time she hit end call without having made any progress. As the tension peaked, a new whisper hit the rumor mill. The police were investigating whether Darius had a history of filming couples without their consent, potentially using the footage for blackmail or pornography rings. Nothing was confirmed, but the mere possibility made Jade's blood run cold. What if she was just one of many victims? Did Darius intentionally seduce vulnerable brides or bridesmaids to create explicit material he could exploit? The theory sounded wild, but Jade couldn't dismiss it. If it were true, it meant she had been a pawn in something far more sinister than a one-night betrayal. She began scouring the internet for any mention of Darius's name attached to scandalous photography or blackmail, but the results were inconclusive. Either he had covered his tracks well, or she was chasing shadows. Still, the suspicion gnawed at her, fueling her desperation to stop him. Caden, for his part, felt the ground shift beneath him. As anger blended with concern, he started wondering if Jade had been preyed upon by a manipulator. Yes, she'd made a reprehensible choice, but had Darius engineered that moment, nudged her toward it, and recorded it for profit? The lines of fault became blurred. Sure, Jade was guilty of betrayal, but was she also a victim in a larger scheme? He found himself in a moral quagmire, torn between the love he once felt for Jade, the hatred he felt for her betrayal, and the protective instinct that wanted to shield her from a predator like Darius. Lorraine tried to reconnect with her son, urging him to leave Jade for good, painting the fiasco as irredeemable. But in her heart, she also worried about Jade's safety if Darius truly was dangerous. She just didn't voice that part out loud. Meanwhile, Jade's mother, who had mostly stayed in the background, tried to reach out to Lorraine, offering tearful apologies on her daughter's behalf, begging for understanding. The tension rippled through both families, fracturing whatever fragile bonds had formed. The stage was set for a confrontation with Darius, but no one knew how or when it would occur. One night, Jade got a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the rooftop bar on 9th at midnight. Don't be late." Her heart lurched. Something told her it was Darius. Despite the fear, she felt compelled to go. If there was a chance to retrieve the tape or negotiate a truce, she had to try. She left a voicemail for Caden, telling him she was meeting Darius and that if anything happened, this was where she'd be. She arrived at the rooftop bar, which was nearly empty at that hour. The wind whipped her hair, and the neon skyline blinked around them. Darius stood by the edge, illuminated in flickering light. She approached cautiously, demanding answers. He greeted her with a smug smile. He claimed he'd received offers from tabloids and private collectors who were into scandalous real-life footage. He teased that Jade might be able to outbid them, or that perhaps she'd be willing to resume their affair for hush rights. Disgust flared in Jade, and she erupted in anger. She threatened to go to the police, the media, and expose him for the manipulative predator she suspected he was. He laughed and said, "Who would believe you? You have more to lose than I do." But just then, a glimmer of movement in the corner of Jade's eye made her realize they weren't alone. Emerging from the shadows, Caden stepped forward, phone in hand, apparently recording. He had shown up, perhaps out of concern, or maybe in a last-ditch effort to salvage something of his marriage or his dignity. Darius's smug grin wavered. Caden told him he'd heard every word, that he had enough to bring to the authorities for attempted blackmail. Darius tried to snatch the phone, but Caden stepped back, adrenaline surging. A tense standoff ensued. Jade pleaded for calm, for no one to do anything reckless. She felt tears burn at the corners of her eyes. This was the man she had betrayed, now standing up for her in a twisted final showdown against the man who had manipulated her vulnerability. Darius snarled that they'd regret crossing him. Then he tried to break free, dashing for the exit. Caden lunged after him, grabbing his jacket. The two men grappled, fists flying, curses ripping through the night air. Jade screamed, looking around for security, for anyone to intervene. In a flurry of rage and fear, Caden managed to pin Darius down, demanding he give up any copies of the tape. Darius refused, thrashing beneath him until two security guards rushed in, wrestling both men apart. The altercation ended with the police being called. Jade and Caden spent the early hours of the morning at the precinct giving statements. Darius, bruised and livid, was held for questioning. and the police seemed more inclined to believe Jade and Caden's story now that they had an audio recording of Darius hinting at blackmail. It was the break they needed to stop him from further exploitation. But the damage to Jade and Caden's marriage was already done. The question was whether this confrontation would lead to some semblance of closure or if the betrayal was too deep for them to heal. Over the following weeks, law enforcement pieced together more about Darius's background. It turned out Jade wasn't the first person he had filmed without explicit consent. There were rumors he had used his position of trust as a wedding photographer to catch intimate moments from multiple couples, though not all as blatant as Jade's. Some alleged he'd intentionally pushed boundaries, flirting, creating moments to exploit, and filming them for potential profit later. A few hesitant victims came forward once they heard about Jade's case in the rumor mill. The police compiled enough evidence to press charges ranging from unauthorized surveillance to attempted blackmail. It appeared Darius would face a serious legal battle, though the outcome was still uncertain, as many victims were reluctant to testify or reveal their identities. In the midst of this slow-moving legal drama, Jade and Caden found themselves forced into a painful reevaluation of their relationship. Jade tried everything to atone. Therapy sessions, heartfelt letters, apologies to Lorraine. Caden wasn't sure if he could ever trust her again, but seeing how thoroughly Darius had manipulated the situation made him realize Jade's lapse, while unforgivable, was also entangled in a bigger story of coercion and exploitation. Their marriage hung by a thread. Perhaps therapy could help them rebuild from the wreckage, or maybe it was beyond saving. Late one night, Caden and Jade sat in the dark living room lit only by a single lamp. Tears slid down Jade's cheeks as she admitted she couldn't blame him if he wanted a divorce, that her love for him hadn't diminished, but she understood he might never look at her the same way. Caden stared at the floor for what felt like eternity, then quietly said he wasn't ready to give up yet. He explained he was still seething with betrayal, but part of him remembered the woman he loved before the wedding day, the woman he wanted to build a life with. If they ended it now, Darius would win in every conceivable way. That shared desire to deny Darius a victory formed a fragile bond between them. They decided to at least attempt reconciliation, though the path ahead would be brutal. In a bittersweet turn, Jade's story became something of a cautionary tale in the local media. A city magazine ran an expose on how unscrupulous wedding vendors could manipulate or extort couples. They kept Jade's identity anonymous, but the article's details made it easy for those in the know to connect the dots. Lorraine was interviewed under a pseudonym, expressing her heartbreak over seeing her family's private agony turned into public gossip. She hoped that, if nothing else, the story would prevent others from enduring similar trauma. But the magazine piece also reignited online chatter, with comment sections rife with moral judgments, conspiracies, and victim blaming. Jade quickly learned the harsh reality of public shaming. Once a story is out there, it's impossible to fully rein it back in. Legal proceedings against Darius dragged on, hindered by an overworked system and the complexities of proving certain charges. Meanwhile, Jade and Caden soldiered through couples therapy, addressing not only the infidelity but also Jade's underlying insecurities, Caden's suppressed fears, and the ways in which their relationship had become a pressure cooker long before the wedding. Some sessions ended in tears, others in shouting matches, but occasionally they found a spark of hope. They realized that to stand any chance, they had to start from scratch, acknowledging every ugly truth they had buried before. Months later, in a hearing closed to the public to protect privacy, Jade testified about what happened that night, how she felt cornered emotionally, how Darius had flirted aggressively. She didn't deny her responsibility in consenting, but she emphasized the manipulative tactics he used and how he recorded everything secretly. Another woman testified about a similar situation, though in her case, she'd stopped before crossing the line Jade had crossed. Darius's defense team tried to paint Jade as a willing participant, looking to shift blame, but the revelations of other victims made their strategy less convincing. The court case hinged on a combination of evidence, including digital footprints of Darius's communications with tabloids, the raw footage that indicated he'd set up the camera without Jade's clear permission, and the recordings Caden captured on his phone during that rooftop confrontation. Eventually, the judge ruled that there was enough probable cause for multiple criminal charges against Darius, setting the stage for a full trial. During this interim period, Jade managed to keep her job, albeit with damage to her reputation. She avoided social gatherings where tongues might wag, focusing instead on quiet nights with Caden, doggedly working to rebuild trust. Lorraine, after a long period of icy silence, accepted an invitation to dinner at their apartment. It was tense, with forced politeness and brittle smiles, but at least it was a start. In a heartfelt conversation after dinner, Lorraine told Jade that while she might never fully forgive her for that betrayal, she recognized that Jade was also a victim. Jade took the words as a tentative olive branch. As the trial approached, the city buzzed with speculation. Even though the judge had imposed a partial gag order on the details, the high-profile nature of the story, the bride and photographer scandal, ensured it stayed in public awareness. Local TV stations occasionally covered updates, and gossip websites continued to fan the flames with recycled hearsay. In the swirl of rumors, Jade and Caden found themselves forging a fragile solidarity. At times, they even rediscovered the empathy that brought them together in the first place, forging small moments of connection. Whether it was cooking a meal together or watching a late-night movie, each fleeting normalcy felt like a triumph over the chaos Darius had inflicted. Yet every now and then, the heartbreak would resurface, especially at night when Caden's mind conjured images he couldn't unsee. Jade would cry herself to sleep, weighed down by guilt. Their life became a balancing act of moving forward and dealing with the scars they carried. On the day of the trial, Jade, wearing a modest black dress, took the stand as the prosecution's key witness. The courtroom was hushed, reporters scribbling notes in the back rows. Darius sat at the defense table, looking far less confident than before, but he occasionally shot Jade cold, disapproving looks. Under questioning, Jade recounted how they'd met, the events of the wedding day, and the night in question. She admitted her personal wrongdoing, acknowledging the moral failing of cheating on her husband, but she also described how she discovered the camera had been rolling without her knowledge or consent, how Darius had teased her about leaking it, how she and Caden later caught him red-handed discussing blackmail. The defense tried to undermine her credibility, suggesting she was fabricating the blackmail angle to salvage her own reputation. Jade held her ground, pointing to the recorded evidence and the testimonies of other victims. By the end of her cross-examination, her face was tear-streaked, but she had presented a coherent account. Caden's turn came next. He described discovering the scandal, the shock, the heartbreak, and the subsequent confrontation on the rooftop. Though he struggled with emotion, he managed to keep his composure, focusing on the facts of how Darius had threatened to profit from the tape. The jury listened intently, some looking sympathetic. Darius refused to testify, letting his lawyers do the talking. They argued that Jade and Caden were painting him as a scapegoat to cover up their own marital fiasco. But as more evidence was introduced, emails, text messages, partial financial records indicating negotiations with salacious online outlets, the defense's argument weakened. After a tense week of witness statements, the trial culminated in closing arguments. The prosecution stressed that while Jade's act of infidelity was not on trial, the malicious intent of capturing and distributing intimate footage without consent was. The defense scrambled, alleging entrapment or misunderstandings, but the weight of the evidence felt substantial. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict on several counts related to unlawful surveillance and attempted extortion, a collective hush fell over the courtroom, followed by a rush of hushed gasps and whispered commentary. Darius's sentencing was scheduled for a later date, and reporters clamored outside the courthouse. Jade and Caden slipped out through a side exit, both visibly shaken but also relieved. In the back seat of a cab heading home, they looked at each other in silence for a long moment. A sense of closure washed over them. The source of their public humiliation had been held to account, yet the personal cost remained incalculable. Caden finally exhaled and took Jade's hand gently. She cried softly, and he brushed a tear from her cheek. The months following the trial were a slow, arduous climb towards something resembling normalcy. Jade returned to work under close scrutiny, but most of her colleagues had grown tired of the gossip, moving on to the next scandal. Caden immersed himself in his job, seeking new projects that would keep him busy and distracted. They moved into a smaller apartment across town, partly to distance themselves from the memories tied to their old place, and partly because they needed a fresh start. Couples therapy sessions continued, though they scaled back as they learned healthier ways to communicate. There were days when the wound still bled, but slowly the scab began to form. Lorraine, though never completely letting go of her bitterness, started visiting them at the new apartment. She'd bring homemade casseroles, as if trying to offer a semblance of home in the midst of their fractured reality. She and Jade exchanged strained smiles at first, but eventually progressed to cautious acceptance of each other's presence. The mother-in-law-daughter-in-law relationship was forever changed, but not doomed to open hostility. They found they could agree on small matters, like which local produce stand had the best fruit or which show was worth watching. It wasn't a fairy tale resolution, but it was enough for them to function as a family again, at least in appearances. Local media outlets, predictably, lost interest once the verdict was passed and new scandals emerged elsewhere. People in Jade and Caden's professional and social circles sometimes whispered, but for the most part, the city moved on. Life had a way of normalizing even the most dramatic episodes with the passage of time. Still, the core truth remained: Jade had betrayed Caden in a moment of weakness, and that act had been exploited by a predator who nearly destroyed their lives. The moral complexity lingered, leaving them to grapple with the fact that Jade was both culprit and victim, that Caden was simultaneously wronged and also complicit in choosing to fight for the marriage. And Lorraine, trying to protect her son, ended up unleashing a chain reaction that forced them to confront a dark reality. On a rainy afternoon, a year after the wedding, Jade and Caden visited the Grand Hotel where the ceremony had taken place. The management had invited them to a rebranding event, hoping to bury past scandals under a new image. They stood in the lobby, gazing at the ornate decor where they had once exchanged vows, hearts full of hope and illusions of perfection. Caden squeezed Jade's hand and she squeezed back, neither speaking. The memory of that night still loomed, but they had survived its aftermath. They wandered through the corridor where the lounge was, where Jade first drank champagne with Darius, and the memories threatened to drown her. But with Caden by her side, she felt a spark of resilience. They didn't linger. They made a quiet exit, stepping into the drizzle outside. Rain tapped against the pavement, washing away the city's dust. A fleeting metaphor, perhaps, for the way they were trying to wash away the stain of betrayal. Time would tell if their marriage could truly endure the weight of what had happened. But they had reached a place of fragile unity, shaped by heartbreak and tempered by an unwillingness to let. Their story stood as a sobering reminder that no matter how careful you are, life can throw you into a moral labyrinth where you can lose yourself in a single, reckless moment. Yet if there was any hope within this tragedy, it was that people could still find a way to stand up against exploitation and salvage some dignity even in the face of crippling shame. As Jade and Caden walked home that evening, hair damp from the rain, they each held a quiet, complicated sense of resolution. The ghost of that videotape would never fully disappear, nor would the betrayal. But in the darkness of their trials, they discovered a deeper truth: that facing the aftermath together, acknowledging the full measure of their failings and their love, was the only way to reclaim their lives from the shadows of that wedding night.